Hello guys, this is Brian Perales, your host for Lifting the Veil. Our main objective is to challenge you guys to step into the rabbit hole, to open your consciousness to think deeper, just by listening to ordinary people with an extraordinary story. We all have a message to tell the world. We will be interviewing people who speak with no boundaries, from people who had near-death experiences, spiritual, or some deep revelation from their soul journey. Thanks for joining us, and be prepared to transform your mind, lifting the veil.
In the story on the pre-birth planning of accidents, I share the story of a woman named Christina, who is now in her 60s. Many years ago, when Christina was in her early 20s, she was employed as an administrative assistant at Pomona College in Southern California. One of her daily duties in that job was to pick up her boss's mail, and the mailboxes were in the basement of the building. So on one particular day, Christina descended those stairs to the basement mailboxes. When she inserted her hand into the mailbox to retrieve the mail, there was a pipe bomb that someone had planted that day, and the bomb detonated. The force from this explosion was so great that it actually picked Christina up off the ground and hurled her 10 feet backwards against a concrete wall. There were 6-foot splinters of wood that were shot like arrows out of a bow into the wall around her. Both eardrums were ruptured, 2 fingers were severed, and flames from the explosion scorched Christina's body from head to toe. When she got to the hospital, doctors actually had to hold magnets over her eyeballs to extract the shrapnel from the pipe. So we are talking here about a level of suffering that's almost unimaginable to you and me. Now, her recovery took 2 years and 10 reconstructive surgeries. At one point during the 2-year recovery period, she was lying in her hospital bed in a great deal of pain when she suddenly heard a voice inside her head, a voice that was not her own. It turns out that the force from this explosion, in addition to doing a lot of damage to her body, had opened up her psychic gifts. Christina had become clairaudient, and the voice she heard inside her head that day was a spirit guide. The guide said to her, "You planned this." And so, of course, Christina said, "Well, why in the world did I do that?" And the guide told her, and here's what he said. The guide said, "You wanted, before you were born, to have a lifetime as a gifted healer. And you knew, pre-birth, that if you could heal yourself from the devastating effects of this accident, you could go on to bring that wisdom and knowledge about healing to others." This is, in fact, exactly what happened. Christina went on to get a PhD in speech-language pathology. She set up a private clinical healing practice. And at this point in her life, she's healed literally thousands of people. When I interviewed Christina, she said 2 extraordinary things to me. One was, she said, "I have completely forgiven the person who planted the bomb." That alone, given her level of suffering, I think is remarkable. But then she said something even more amazing. She said, "Rob, I'm deeply grateful to the person who planted the bomb." That, I think, shows you what can happen through an awareness of pre-birth planning. Because she came into this knowledge that was given to her by her spirit guide, and then worked with it over a period of years, she was able to forgive the person who inflicted all that suffering on her. And then she actually got to a place of gratitude for the experience. You can imagine that if she had never come into an understanding of her pre-birth plan, she probably would have been angry, bitter, resentful for the rest of her life. She might even have devoted her life to tracking down the bomber and taking revenge. But because Christina came into an understanding that this was her plan, this was something she chose and agreed to prior to birth, and really worked with that concept over a period of years, she was able to forgive and then get to a place of total gratitude. She basically changed her entire life by understanding that it was all part of her soul's plan. I certainly believe that we, or rather our souls, plan our biggest challenges for us prior to birth. And what I've seen in my research, the main reasons our souls plan big challenges for us are 1, to balance karma, 2, healing, 3, in service to others, 4, in order to experience contrast, and now a 5th one, and that is to heal false beliefs. Well, the soul group, as I understand it, is a collection of souls who are at more or less the same evolutionary stage. So you and the other members of your soul group will reincarnate repeatedly together, playing every conceivable role in service to each other so that you can learn and grow. So you and the members of your soul group will be, for example, father and daughter, mother and son, husband and wife, brother and sister, best of friends, mortal enemies, and even murderer and the one who is murdered. At the soul level, there's no judgment about any of these roles. They're all played out in service to each other for learning, for growth. A spirit guide is a highly evolved non-physical being who helps the soul and who helps us plan the life prior to birth. So what will happen at the soul level, basically, the soul will create the life plan. Then the soul will take a portion of its energy. That energy becomes you, the personality that's going to incarnate. You are informed of what the life plan will be. You are shown scenes from your upcoming life. And then you have an opportunity to agree to the plan, or you also have an opportunity to say, no, I don't agree to the plan. Or you can express fears, worries, doubts, or concerns. Most personalities will agree to the plan as it's conceived of by the soul. Occasionally a personality says no, and then the plan is actually revised. Sometimes the personality expresses fear or worry or doubt. If that happens, then your spirit guides step in. You sense the greater wisdom of your guides in your soul. You sense the great love of your guides in your soul. And so when they reassure you that the plan is in your best interest, almost always, if you have doubts, they're assuaged at that point. You still can say no, but almost always you would then agree to the life plans. We go into people's pre-birth planning sessions and we listen to the conversations in which these great challenges are planned. When Stacy does that, she sees something in her mind's eye that she refers to as an incredibly elaborate flowchart. It looks like a flowchart. Now, what is a flowchart? It's a series of decision points, and at each point, if you choose A, then X happens. If you choose B, then Y happens. She describes the flowchart as being so vast, so intricate, that it's almost beyond human comprehension. The flowchart represents the soul taking into account all the free will choices that we, the personalities, might make once we're on the earth plane. So it's not the case that your soul creates a plan and then everything is set in stone and is predestined. That's actually not at all what happens. The plan is this flowchart in which your free will decisions are anticipated by your soul. So it occurs within certain parameters that are set up by your soul prior to birth. But then once you get here, you have a lot of free will, and that's what makes the experience of incarnation truly meaningful. The term that I've come to use is divine virtues. We are here to develop on behalf of our souls certain divine virtues and then express them on the physical plane in ways that they can't really be expressed in the non-physical realm. So what are the divine virtues? What I see in my research on pre-birth planning is a collection of 30 to 35 qualities that come up more often than others in the pre-birth planning sessions. These are the divine virtues or the qualities the soul wants to cultivate and express in the physical realm. They are things like compassion, unconditional love, self-love, patience, forgiveness, empathy. One that's not so obvious that comes up quite a bit is self-referencing. What does that mean? It means that you learn to look to yourself as the highest and best source and authority for all wisdom and knowledge, rather than anyone external to you. And there's a collection of about 35 of these that come up again and again. This, I think, is really why we plan life challenges, because those challenges stimulate the development of these divine virtues. There are certain qualities that are inherent in the soul and that really constitute the soul's identity. These would be love, peace, and joy. Soul wants to come into what you could call a more profound self-knowing. It wants to understand what it is, who it is. So how do you come into a more profound self-knowing? Well, one very powerful way to do that is to experience the opposite of who you really are. And once you experience the opposite, then you have a deeper understanding of who you really are. This is an idea that comes up in a very eloquent way in one of the Conversation with God books. And God asked the author, Neil Donald Walsh, to explain it using the analogy of the white room, which goes like this. Imagine that you are a white being in a white room. So the ceiling is white, the floor is white, all the walls around you are white, everything in this room is white, including you. Now, if you are such a being in such a room, how do you know that you're white? The answer is you don't. And in fact, you actually can't until you experience something that is other than white. Then once you've had that experience, then you understand much more deeply what it means to be a white being. This, I think, is the crux of what the soul is doing on the physical plane. In the non-physical realm, we as souls are love, peace, and joy. But because there's no contrast to that, we come here to the physical realm to experience the contrast, things like sadness, things that would fall into the category of not love or non-love, because then, when we return to the non-physical, the white room, so to speak, then we know who we really are. A woman named Valerie, who in this lifetime lost both her fiancé and her only son in ways that we would consider to be early or premature. And what happened in this particular case is her fiancé died literally 2 days after they became engaged. He was a deep sea diver, and he was injured in an accident while out at sea under the water, and he died 2 days after they had announced their engagement. Her son, Dustin, died at the age of 16 of a seemingly accidental drug overdose. So in researching the Death of a Loved One chapter, I talked with Dustin's soul. Corby channeled the soul. And we asked Dustin's soul, was this seemingly tragic death planned prior to birth, and if so, why? And what Dustin's soul told us was that it was all agreed upon before birth, not just his death, but also DC, who was the fiancé. His death was also agreed upon. And Dustin and DC had their own particular reasons for wanting to have relatively short lifetimes. They made that decision prior to incarnating and also prior to creating a life plan with Valerie. Valerie then came to them after they had made those decisions and said, I'm planning another lifetime. I've been with both of you before. I love you both very, very much. I would like it if you would share this new lifetime with me. And so DC and Dustin explained to Valerie, well, we might do that, but we're not planning to be there for very long. And they gave her the choice. And Valerie responded by saying, well, I understand that I'm going to lose you at a young age, but I will work with that. I will use that to foster my own evolution, my own growth. And so in the pre-birth planning session, we actually hear the conversation between Valerie and DC and Valerie and Dustin, in which they tell her they won't be here very long, and then she agrees to that upfront in order to have them as part of this lifetime. Now, when Corby channeled Dustin's soul, we asked specifically about the drug overdose. And what the soul told us was that it wasn't the quantity of drugs that took Dustin's life, but rather the decision prior to birth to end the incarnation at that time. And the drugs themselves were simply an exit point. You know, prior to birth, we each plan several different exit points when we can leave the physical realm and go back to the non-physical. You would take an exit point under one of two circumstances. Either you did everything you came here to do, or the soul concluded that you couldn't do what you came here to do. And in either case, it's appropriate then to go back to the non-physical realm. The soul went on to explain to us that had the pre-birth plan not called for Dustin to die at that time, the exact same quantity of drugs would not have taken his life. So here on the physical realm, we think, well, he took too much of the drugs and that's what killed him. But it wasn't the quantity of drugs, it was the soul level decision to utilize that as the means to end the incarnation. It was exactly what was planned before birth. Then we asked the question, why would Valerie agree to such a painful plan? And basically, the explanation was very, very simple. It was all about lessons in balance. We were told that Valerie had a number of previous lives in which certain tragic things had occurred that knocked her out of balance, and she stayed that way for the entire lifetime. What I've seen in my work is that if we don't master a particular lesson in a past life, we often choose it again in order to master it. And this is exactly what Valerie did. She had been knocked off balance many times in previous lives. She wanted that experience again for the very simple reason that she wanted to master the lesson of balance. She wanted these two deaths to knock her way off center, but then find her way back to center over the course of this lifetime. It was really as simple as that. I share the story of a young man in New York. His name is Jason Thurston. Jason planned prior to birth to have a severe accident, and what happened in his case is that in the summer of 2004, he and his wife and their children were having a party, a summer barbecue in their backyard. They had a swimming pool, and at one point during the party, he dove headfirst into the pool, just as he had many times before. But on this particular day, Jason hit his head on the bottom of the pool. He was knocked unconscious, and when he came to in the hospital the next day, he was a quadriplegic. We did a session with a medium in Chicago named Deb DeBari, and we talked with Jason's spirit guides. And what they explained to us is that normally, if the pre-birth plan did not call for an accident like that, at the point at which he was about to dive into the pool, a guide would have intervened in some way. The guide could have put the thought into his mind, don't dive in, or the guide could actually have physically intervened in some way, although that would be more unusual. But what happened in this case is that because the accident was part of his pre-birth plan, the guides basically stepped back. They let him dive into the pool and they allowed the accident to occur. This is basically the same thing that happens in regard to death or getting on an airplane that crashes. If that is part of the pre-birth plan, if it's one of the pre-chosen exit points, the guides will step back and not cause the person to miss the flight. If it's not part of the pre-birth plan, the guides may very well intervene, again, either physically intervening or whispering to the person such that they have a thought, don't get on the plane. And that's how those kinds of things happen. The fact of the matter is that the incarnation, the lifetime, will end when the soul desires for it to end. So we can attempt to control and manage things at the level of the personality here on the earth plane, but basically we're not in charge. And that's by our own agreement prior to birth. We know that coming into the physical plane. So if the soul has concluded that it's accomplished everything it wants to in the lifetime or can't, in one way or another, the lifetime will come to an end. There's one story I read about in which I believe it was a husband and wife were at home. The wife was upstairs in the bedroom reading a book in bed, and the husband was in the garage attempting to commit suicide. And fortunately, in this case, the wife was clairaudient, so her guide said to her, he's in the garage, he's attempting to commit suicide, and she immediately ran downstairs, intervened, and prevented the suicide. So those kinds of interventions occur as well. Another true story in which it's the mother of someone in my life, and this woman was driving down a multiple lane highway. The lane ahead of her was completely clear, and she suddenly heard a voice in her head that said, change lanes. She'd never had a psychic experience before. She didn't know what was happening, but she listened and she got into another lane. A couple of seconds later, a car from another lane flipped into the lane that she had been in, and she probably would have been killed if she hadn't changed lanes when she did. It's not the case that everything that happens that's challenging was planned before birth, and that's true also for events that we would consider non-challenging or even joyful. It's not the case that everything is planned prior to birth. You always have free will in each and every moment, and you can use your free will to deviate from your pre-birth plan whenever you like and as much or as little as you like. Now, normally, if you choose to deviate from the pre-birth plan, it will actually create more suffering in one way or another. And that's the universe's way of trying to get you back on track, to let you know you're off the plan. But even if you're on the path, most of the big challenges will have been planned prior to birth. It comes down basically, though, to law of attraction. You know, the frequency that you vibrate at attracts things to you that are of the same frequency. So if you make low vibrational, unloving choices, whether you're on your path or not that was planned before birth, when you lower your vibration, it permits challenging sorts of things to come into your experience. So for people who would like to minimize the amount of challenge in your life, and you can't do that completely because some of it is planned, but if you would like to do that, the thing to do is vibrate at a high frequency. Go through your days as much as possible in a vibration of love, joy, appreciation, and gratitude. And that will draw to you things of the same frequency. I share the story of a woman, Marcia, who planned prior to birth to be a dwarf. She's 4 feet 8 inches tall. That was the challenge she planned for herself, and it was basically set up as a challenge to learn unconditional self-love. But once she put that challenge into place, and we all do this, she planned to put support around her that would make it possible for her to handle the challenge in a positive way. Marcia chose to do this by planning with certain animals to be her pets and love her unconditionally in order to teach her how to love herself unconditionally. So it's fascinating. We go into her pre-birth planning session and she's there talking to her future dogs, her future pets, a future horse, There's actually a rooster named Crooked Beak who's in the pre-birth planning session. We hear her talking to Crooked Beak, and they're talking about how the animals will love her unconditionally because she knows, especially as a child and as a dwarf, the other kids at school are going to be cruel to her. She wants to come home to the loving embrace of her pets. We see souls planning not just the big challenges, but also how they're going to cope with them and how they're going to heal from them. All of this is taken into account in the pre-birth planning process. Now, you talked about how someone could feel victimized by their own soul. The only way you could feel that way is if you didn't know that you had agreed to your soul's plan. But in fact, we all do agree to it. We have choice, and we're shown scenes from the upcoming lifetime. These are holographic, three-dimensional images that we go into. We actually feel what we're going to feel. So we know what's coming in the upcoming lifetime. And that's why really we're not victims at all. I do see from time to time an example of someone who, you might say, bit off more than they can chew. There are some souls who, for whatever reason, are in a hurry to get back to the earth plane in terms of linear time. And sometimes they are not as contemplative in the pre-birth planning process as might be advised. There are actually instances in which a guide will say to a soul or the incarnating personality, "You're taking on a little bit too much. We don't advise that you do this." Then the person says, "No, I can handle it. I want to do it anyway."
Yep.
And they ignore the spirit guide's advice. That generally is not a good idea, but it does happen on occasion. And I think that there are great souls, highly evolved souls, who from time to time agree as part of a person's pre-birth plan to play a black or negative role, so to speak, in service to that person.